Have you ever wondered how one of the darkest chapters in American history began? It didn't start with whips and chains, but with a quiet, deceptive promise. In 1619, a ship named the White Lion sailed into Point Comfort, Virginia. It wasn't carrying gold or jewels, but 20 human souls, the first recorded Africans brought to English America. No one could have known that this single event would set in motion a story of suffering and resilience that would last for over 200 years and forever shape the soul of a nation. At first, they weren't even called slaves. They were traded for supplies and labeled as servants. But there was a critical difference. While European indentured servants could work their way to freedom, these men and women from Africa were trapped. An invisible wall started to rise, built not of stone, but of skin color, social status, and soon, the law. The early 1600s were a time of intense competition. European powers, Spain, Portugal, Britain, France, the Netherlands, were all scrambling to carve out their piece of the New World. The American South was a land of incredible potential, its soil rich and fertile. But who would work these vast fields? The Native American populations had been decimated by disease and conflict, and there weren't enough European settlers to do the work. The colonizers believed they found their answer across the Atlantic, in Africa. This gave birth to the infamous triangular trade. Ships left Europe with goods, sailed to Africa to trade those goods for people, and then crossed the brutal Middle Passage to the Americas. It was a cold, calculated system designed purely for profit, with a devastating human cost. By the mid-1600s, what started as a desperate measure had become a structured, legal institution. The colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas became addicted to cash crops like tobacco, rice, and indigo. Each crop demanded an army of laborers, and the demand for enslaved Africans skyrocketed. To protect this new economic engine, new laws were written. In 1662, Virginia passed a landmark law. A child born to an enslaved woman would automatically inherit her status. Slavery was no longer just a life sentence. It was hereditary, passed down through bloodlines, from one generation to the next. The colonies flourished. Plantations expanded. Europe grew richer. But if you looked at the trade ledgers and account books, the true cost was invisible. The enslaved were denied education, basic human rights, and even their own names. They were reduced to numbers, property, and tools in an empire built on their backs. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the African continent was being torn apart. European traders turned kingdoms against each other, persuading or forcing them to capture and sell their own people. Every ship that left Africa's shores left behind a trail of broken families, shattered communities, and stolen futures. But even in the deepest darkness, the human spirit fought to survive. The enslaved people carried more than just their physical strength across the Atlantic. They brought their culture, their languages, their music, and their faith. These were the seeds of identity, planted in foreign soil, that would one day grow into something powerful and new. As the years turned into decades, slavery became the very backbone of the colonial economy. By the 1700s, the enslaved population had grown dramatically. The South was built on it, and even the northern colonies, while less dependent on slave labor, profited from the trade and industries that supported it. But at the same time, the world was changing. The Enlightenment was sweeping across Europe, bringing with it revolutionary ideas about liberty, equality, and human rights. A glaring contradiction began to emerge. How could a land that prided itself on freedom be built on the bondage of others? In 1776, when the American colonies declared their independence, the powerful words of the Declaration, "All men are created equal," rang out across the globe. But for the nearly 500,000 enslaved people living in America, those words were a hollow promise. Even the founding fathers were conflicted. Men like Thomas Jefferson wrote eloquently about the evils of slavery while owning hundreds of enslaved people themselves. The young nation was born with a deep, moral crack in its foundation. Yet, amidst the hypocrisy, a quiet resistance was always simmering. Enslaved individuals formed secret support networks. They gathered in hidden places to share stories and a sense of community. They created spirituals, songs with coded messages of hope and plans for escape. These melodies were more than just music. They were the heartbeat of survival. a testament to the enduring belief that one day, freedom would be more than just a dream. Towards the end of the 18th century, the first real signs of change appeared. In 1807, Great Britain banned the transatlantic slave trade, and the United States followed suit in 1808. But this was a deceptive victory. The law only stopped the legal importation of enslaved Africans from overseas. It did nothing to end slavery itself. Inside America, the institution grew even stronger, fueled by a new, white gold, cotton. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 made processing cotton incredibly fast and profitable. This ignited an insatiable demand for labor in the Deep South. The enslaved population exploded, growing from around 700,000 in 1790 to nearly 4 million by the mid-1800s. Now families weren't just being torn apart by ships from Africa, but by domestic slave markets within the United States itself. America was splitting into two different worlds. The North was industrializing, its cities growing, its economy based on free labor. The South, however, clung desperately to its plantation system, convinced its entire way of life depended on slavery. This growing divide, this moral and economic chasm, would eventually lead the nation into its bloodiest conflict. But before the storm of the Civil War, before the rise of powerful abolitionist movements, and before the roar for freedom grew too loud to ignore, there was a heavy, lingering silence. It was a silence carried in the whispered prayers of those who still dared to dream of liberty, even as they toiled under a sky that promised it to everyone but them. Imagine America in the early 1800s. It was a nation of vast fields and rising factories, but beneath the surface, there was a deep, unsettling silence. This wasn't the silence of peace. It was the stillness before a great storm. A moral question was stirring in the soul of the country. Could a nation founded on the ideal of liberty truly stand while millions of people remained in chains? The world around America was changing. In Haiti, a revolution had created the first free black republic. Across Europe, people were fighting for freedom and equality. These ideas reached American shores like distant thunder, planting seeds of change. In the North, a new movement was quietly taking shape. The abolitionists. These were everyday people, teachers, writers, preachers, who believed slavery wasn't just an injustice, but a profound moral wrong. Figures like William Lloyd Garrison, who started his newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831, began to speak out, demanding an immediate end to slavery. And then, the voices of those who had escaped bondage, like the brilliant Frederick Douglass, rose to tell their own stories. Their words were powerful, exposing the brutal reality of the system and shaking the conscience of the nation. But as the North began to question, the South tightened its grip. The plantation economy, built on the backs of enslaved people, was incredibly profitable. Cotton was king, America's biggest export, fueling industries across the ocean and building immense wealth. For those who benefited, slavery wasn't evil. They called it essential. They defended it with laws, with their interpretation of religion, and with their politics. Two Americas were forming, each believing its vision was the right one. The divide between them grew deeper and more dangerous with every passing year. As the 1830s bled into the 1840s, this moral battle became a political war. The halls of Congress were flooded with petitions demanding the end of slavery. But in 1836, a gag rule was passed, silencing any and all discussion of the topic. For nearly a decade, the very mention of abolition was forbidden in the nation's capital. But you can't legislate away a moral crisis. No law could stop the growing unrest. Across the country, a secret network known as the Underground Railroad began to form. It wasn't a real railroad, but a web of secret routes, safe houses, and incredibly brave people, both black and white, who risked everything to help enslaved individuals escape to freedom in the northern states or Canada. Leaders like Harriet Tubman, who had escaped slavery herself, returned to the South time and time again, guiding hundreds of others along the perilous journey. Each person she rescued was a powerful act of defiance, a symbol of hope in a system designed to crush it. Meanwhile, America was expanding westward. With every new territory came the explosive question: would it be a free state or a slave state? The delicate balance of power between North and South became the central obsession of American politics. Compromises were made, like the Missouri Compromise of 1820 and the Compromise of 1850. But they were like bandages on a deep, festering wound. They couldn't hold the nation together. In homes, churches, and newspapers, the entire country was debating its own soul. Did liberty truly belong to all, or just to some? America was standing on a knife's edge, caught between its founding ideals and its dark reality. Then, in 1852, a single book set the nation ablaze. It was Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. The novel pulled back the curtain on the emotional and moral devastation of slavery, telling a story that resonated with millions. It spread like wildfire, selling hundreds of thousands of copies. For many in the North, it was a horrifying awakening to a cruelty they had tried to ignore. In the South, it was met with fury. They called it a book of lies. It's said that when Abraham Lincoln later met Stowe, he greeted her by saying, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Just 2 years later, in 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act shattered the fragile peace. It declared that settlers in new territories could decide for themselves whether to allow slavery. The result was pure chaos. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups rushed into Kansas, and the territory erupted in violence. It became known as Bleeding Kansas. The argument was no longer just about words. It had turned to bloodshed. Then, in 1857, the Supreme Court delivered a devastating blow. In the Dred Scott decision, the court ruled that black people, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens and had no rights under the Constitution. It felt like the nation's highest institution had officially sided with bondage over liberty. For many, it was a moment of deep despair. But in that darkness, the fire of resistance burned even brighter. A new political party was rising, the Republican Party, founded on the principle that slavery must not be allowed to spread any further. And among its members was a thoughtful lawyer from Illinois, a man whose quiet words carried the weight of moral conviction: Abraham Lincoln. The final years of the 1850s felt like a gathering storm. In 1859, the nation watched, captivated and horrified, as an abolitionist named John Brown tried to ignite an uprising by seizing a federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. His raid failed. He was captured and executed, but his final words echoed across the country, warning that the crimes of this guilty land would not be purged away but with blood. To the South, he was a terrorist. To many in the North, he was a martyr for the cause of freedom. The breaking point came in 1860. Abraham Lincoln was elected president. Even though he didn't call for an immediate end to slavery, his firm opposition to its expansion was enough. For the Southern states, it was the final straw. They saw his election as a direct threat to their entire way of life, their economy, their social order, their political power. One by one, they made a fateful decision. They chose to leave the Union. South Carolina went first, followed by 10 other states. They formed their own nation, the Confederate States of America. The United States, a nation that had once declared itself indivisible, was now broken in two. The future was uncertain, the air thick with dread. Then, in the early morning hours of April 1861, cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The long, tense silence was finally shattered. The Civil War had begun. Imagine the year 1861. A nation, once bound by a single flag, now tears itself apart. This is the story of the American Civil War, a conflict that began to save a union but would ultimately redefine the very meaning of freedom. When the first shots were fired, President Abraham Lincoln's goal wasn't to end slavery. His mission was to hold the nation together. He worried that if he made the war about emancipation, the border states, states with slavery that hadn't left the Union, would join the Confederacy. So, the first battles, like the bloody clashes at Bull Run and Shiloh, were fought not for liberty, but for the survival of the United States. But war has a strange way of forcing a nation to look in the mirror. As Union armies marched south, enslaved men and women risked everything to reach their lines, seeking freedom. They became known as contrabands of war, a legal term for enemy property. But how could a soldier fight alongside people desperate for freedom and still see them as mere property? The moral contradiction was becoming impossible to ignore. At the same time, enslaved people were no longer just watching history unfold. They were shaping it. They escaped plantations, resisted their captors, guided Union troops through unfamiliar territory, and provided crucial intelligence on Confederate movements. A powerful momentum was building, driven by the very people the war was fought over. The struggle for freedom was finding its own voice, right in the heart of the conflict. By 1862, the tide of both war and morality began to turn. The North had suffered devastating losses, but out of this chaos, Lincoln saw a higher purpose taking shape. That summer, in the quiet of his office, he drafted one of the most revolutionary documents in American history, the Emancipation Proclamation. But he couldn't release it just yet. He knew the announcement needed to come after a victory, so its words would ring with the power of triumph, not the desperation of a losing side. That victory finally came in September 1862 at the Battle of Antietam. It was the single bloodiest day in American history, a horrific slaughter that left thousands dead on the battlefield. But the Union's strategic win gave Lincoln the moment he needed. On January 1, 1863, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation into law. Its declaration was simple but earth-shattering. All enslaved people in Confederate-held territories shall be thenceforward, and forever free. Now, this didn't magically free every enslaved person overnight. Its real power was symbolic and moral. It officially transformed the Civil War from a battle over borders into a crusade for human liberty. And critically, it opened the doors for African Americans to join the Union Army, turning men who were once considered property into soldiers fighting for their own freedom. Across the country, a new hope began to spread. From bustling cities in the North to isolated plantations in the South, the word of freedom traveled. Sometimes as a whispered rumor, other times as a triumphant shout. The Union cause was reborn, no longer just a fight for geography, but a righteous battle for justice. As the war dragged on, the human cost became almost unbearable. Towns were left in ruins, families were torn apart by loyalty, and soldiers on both sides fell in staggering numbers. But even amid this devastation, a profound change was taking root. Over 180,000 African American men enlisted in the Union Army and Navy. These weren't just soldiers fighting to preserve a nation. They were fighting for their own humanity, for the right to be recognized as men. One unit, the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, became legendary. Led by a white officer named Robert Gould Shaw, these black soldiers faced not only the enemy but also deep-seated prejudice from their own side. Their incredible bravery, especially during the heroic assault on Fort Wagner, proved their courage beyond any doubt, and inspired thousands more to join the fight. Meanwhile, the immense burden of leadership weighed heavily on President Lincoln. The war was longer and bloodier than anyone had imagined. But through it all, his vision evolved. He came to understand that the Union could never truly be healed until the root cause of its division, slavery, was completely and forever destroyed. He once famously stated, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." These calm, resolute words captured the moral awakening of a nation that had been at war with its own conscience. By 1864, as Lincoln campaigned for re-election, his promise was clear. He would not only save the Union, but also secure the freedom of all its people. The American public responded, re-electing him in a powerful sign that the nation was finally ready to embrace this new, more just cause. The final chapter of the Civil War arrived in early 1865, a mix of tragedy and triumph. As Union forces pushed deeper into the South, the end was in sight. Confederate cities were crumbling, its economy was shattered, and its armies were exhausted. Still, the fighting spirit lingered. Then, on April 9, 1865, at a small Virginia farmhouse in Appomattox Courthouse, it all came to an end. Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered to Union General Ulysses S. Grant. The two men spoke with quiet respect, and with their handshake, the 4-year-long war was over. Just days later, Lincoln addressed a joyful nation. But he spoke not of victory or revenge, but of healing and compassion. His famous words called for a future, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Tragically, the celebration was cut short. On April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, struck down at the very moment of his greatest triumph. He had guided a nation through its darkest hour and delivered freedom to millions, but he would not live to see the peace he fought so hard for. Yet his dream did not die with him. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which formally abolished slavery everywhere in the United States, had already passed Congress in January. It was ratified later that year, declaring that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States. After 246 years, the chains were finally broken. An institution that began with the arrival of the first enslaved Africans had been undone by the immense courage, sacrifice, and unwavering spirit of countless people who refused to let the promise of freedom die. The war had ended, but peace did not come easily. In 1865, the guns of the Civil War fell silent, but the echoes of centuries of bondage still lingered in the hearts and homes of millions. The United States now faced a question just as difficult as the war itself. How do you rebuild a nation torn apart by slavery? For nearly 4 million newly freed men, women, and children, this moment was both a dream realized and a terrifying new reality. The Emancipation Proclamation had declared them free, and the 13th Amendment had made it law. But freedom was more than words on a piece of paper. To truly live, it needed opportunity, land, education, and equality. As the South lay in ruins, the era of Reconstruction began. The federal government, first under President Andrew Johnson and then Congress, attempted to rebuild the nation from its ashes. In 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help formerly enslaved people with food, housing, and crucially, education. Schools were built, teachers traveled from the North, and for the first time, countless African Americans learned to read and write, skills that had been denied to them for generations. Yet, this road to equality was dangerously steep. Former slaveholders, desperate to reclaim their power, pushed back hard. Across the South, new laws known as Black Codes were introduced. These laws restricted where freedmen could work, live, or even travel. It was a cruel bait and switch. Freedom in name, but not in reality. The battle for true liberty, it was clear, was far from over. Then, in 1868, a new light emerged. The 14th Amendment. It granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including the formerly enslaved. 2 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment followed, guaranteeing black men the right to vote. This was a revolutionary shift. For the first time in American history, African Americans began to hold political office. They voted, they served in state legislatures, and even in Congress, actively helping to shape the New South. For a brief, hopeful moment, it seemed the dream of equality was finally within reach. Communities blossomed, churches flourished, and small businesses started to rise. The future, once thought impossible, was beginning to take form. But this progress was not welcomed by everyone. Across the South, resentment brewed and festered. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged from the shadows, using terror, violence, and intimidation to suppress black progress. While their attacks were physical, their true aim was psychological, to crush the spirit of freedom and remind freedmen that the path to equality would be long and brutal. Meanwhile, in the North, political will began to fade. Many grew weary of the constant struggles in the South, eager to simply move on. Then, in 1877, a political compromise effectively ended Reconstruction. Federal troops were pulled out of the South, and with that, the government's protection disappeared. It was a quiet political decision, but its consequences were devastating. African Americans were left vulnerable once again, facing a rising tide of discrimination and injustice. The era of slavery was over, but a new, insidious system of segregation and inequality was beginning to take its place. From the ashes of Reconstruction rose what became known as the Jim Crow era. Starting in the late 19th century, states across the South passed laws to enforce strict racial segregation. Schools, transportation, restaurants, water fountains, every aspect of public life was divided. They called it separate but equal, a phrase that was a hollow, cynical lie. It was separate, but it was never equal. The very nation that had fought a war to abolish slavery now turned its back on its promise of equality. Black citizens were systematically stripped of their right to vote through poll taxes, rigged literacy tests, and outright intimidation. The dream of freedom, once so bright, had turned into a daily struggle for basic dignity. Yet, even in the face of such overwhelming adversity, the spirit of the people refused to be broken. African Americans continued to rise. They built their own businesses, established newspapers to tell their own stories, and created vibrant cultural movements that would change the world. Visionary leaders like Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois emerged, offering different paths forward. Washington urged self-reliance through education and industry, while Du Bois demanded immediate civil rights and social justice. The legacy of slavery was shaping not just the South, but the entire nation. Its shadow stretched deep into the 20th century, influencing labor, politics, and culture. From the sorrowful songs of the enslaved, a new art form was born. The blues. It became a powerful language of endurance, pain, and unshakable hope. The story of slavery hadn't ended. It had transformed into a story of survival. As the years passed, America slowly began to confront the truths it had so long ignored. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s reignited the promise made back in 1865. The promise of equality for all. A new generation of leaders, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, and countless others, carried forward the spirit of those who had once dreamed of freedom while bound in chains. Through marches, speeches, boycotts, and nonviolent protest, they challenged the nation to finally live up to its founding ideals. Their courage was met with violence, but their resolve was unbreakable. Finally, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act outlawed segregation, and in 1965, the Voting Rights Act protected the right to vote for all citizens. It took nearly a century after slavery's abolition for America to begin fulfilling its moral commitment to equality. But even today, the legacy of slavery whispers through the fabric of our society, in persistent inequality, in prejudice, and in the ongoing search for justice. The story of slavery is not just a closed chapter of the past. It is a mirror reflecting how far we have come, and how far we still have to go. The journey that began in 1619, with the arrival of 20 captive Africans on foreign shores, became a saga of endurance, transformation, and rebirth. It's a story that moved through centuries, from bondage to freedom, from silence to voice, from despair to hope. And in that story lies a timeless truth. Chains can bind the body, but they can never imprison the human spirit. Freedom, once awakened, can never be silenced again. Slavery was more than a system of labor. It was a profound test of humanity's conscience. And though it ended in law, its lesson endures. That freedom is not a gift granted by rulers, but a fundamental right earned through courage, unity, and the unbreakable will to be free.
The case may be closed, but criminology never sleeps. Like and subscribe at Join Criminology, and step deeper into the dark with us.